Have you ever watched a movie and wondered why it hit you so hard? Why it stayed with you decades later? Why certain scenes replay in your mind years after the credits rolled, even when you haven't seen the film in ages? Was it the story itself? Or was it the moment in your life when you first experienced it? Because some films don't just entertain us. They attach themselves to who we were when we saw them. And Top Gun is one of those films. When Top Gun roared into theaters in 1986, it didn't simply introduce audiences to supersonic fighter jets and elite Navy pilots. It rewired pop culture. It reshaped cinematic masculinity. It revived failing consumer brands. It redefined how the U.S. military presented itself to the public. And without ever officially admitting it, it became one of the most effective recruiting tools the Pentagon had ever seen. But here's the question most people never stop to ask. How did a movie that almost no one wanted to make become one of the most influential films of its generation? How did something born from doubt, compromise, and near cancellation end up immortal? To understand that, we have to go back, not to Hollywood, but to a magazine page. A movie born from ink, not film. Before Top Gun was a movie, it was just an article. No explosions. No soundtrack. No Tom Cruise. In 1983, journalist Ehud Yoni published a feature in California magazine titled Top Guns. It wasn't written to inspire blockbuster cinema. It wasn't written to sell toys, sunglasses, or flight jackets. It was immersive journalism. Yoni embedded himself with elite Navy pilots training at the Navy Fighter Weapons School at Naval Air Station Miramar, a place insiders casually referred to as Fightertown, USA. This wasn't basic training. This was where the best pilots in the fleet went to be broken down and rebuilt. For 5 grueling weeks, Yoni observed young aviators pushed to psychological and physical extremes. These weren't wide-eyed recruits. These were already elite pilots, men trained to fly million-dollar machines at the edge of human tolerance. And yet, even here, ego ruled. The article didn't glamorize combat. It focused on rivalry, obsession, fear, and identity. It captured the unspoken truth that for many of these men, flying wasn't just a job, it was who they were. Paired with stunning aerial photography taken by a Navy commander, the article had texture. Authenticity. Wait. When producers Don Simpson and Jerry Bruckheimer read it, they didn't see a documentary. They saw raw material. They saw speed, competition, sex appeal, and something Hollywood could shape into myth. But Hollywood didn't agree. The movie nobody wanted. It's hard to believe now, but Top Gun was considered a bad idea. Studios weren't convinced audiences wanted a movie about fighter pilots. The jargon felt inaccessible. The world felt too specific. The Cold War backdrop felt risky. Executives asked the same question again and again. Where's the story? Multiple screenwriters passed. Directors like David Cronenberg and John Carpenter declined. The material felt thin. Too technical. Too niche. Eventually, writers Jim Cash and Jack Epps Jr. signed on. Epps did something unusual. Something that would later define the film's texture. He attended declassified Top Gun classes. He flew in a real F-14 Tomcat. What he experienced wasn't cinematic. It was terrifying. The first draft leaned heavily into realism. The procedures, the politics, the discipline of naval aviation. The producers hated it. What survived wasn't realism. It was feeling. And that choice, intentional or not, would define everything that followed. So ask yourself, what makes a story last longer? Accuracy, or emotion? The Navy didn't lend its jets. It rented them. Ever wonder how much it costs to fly a fighter jet? In the mid-1980s, each hour of F-14 Tomcat flight time cost Paramount roughly $7,600. And the meter never stopped running. By the end of production, the studio had paid the Pentagon approximately $1.8 million for aircraft access, aircraft carriers, pilots, fuel, and Miramar itself. That was nearly 12% of the film's entire $15 million budget. Here's the irony most people miss. One F-14 Tomcat cost the U.S. government around $38 million to build. Paramount was essentially handed access to billions of dollars of military hardware for the price of a mid-budget action film. And in return, the Navy got the most flattering cinematic portrait it had ever received. Was that accidental? Or was it the beginning of something much bigger? Realism has a price. Could CGI have done this in 1986? Not even remotely. Every jet you see in Top Gun is real. Every carrier deck launch is real. Every deafening flyby is real. And that realism came with consequences. Director Tony Scott initially wanted cockpit dialogue filmed in actual jets. The Navy agreed. The actors tried. It failed instantly. The engines were so loud that dialogue was completely unusable. Communication systems couldn't compensate. The footage looked incredible, but sounded like chaos. So the production improvised. They built a full-scale F-14 cockpit replica, mounted it on a motorized gimbal inside a hangar near Burbank Airport. Crew members sprayed actors with water to simulate sweat and strain. Yes, those iconic close-ups of Maverick weren't filmed at Mach 2. They were filmed with a spray bottle and a rotating platform. But the danger was still real. The actors flew in real jets for reference, and nearly all of them got sick. Tom Cruise vomited on his first flight. Most of the cast followed. The exception, Anthony Edwards. Goose, fittingly, had the strongest stomach of them all. And the aerial footage? It wasn't staged. It was filmed by Navy pilots chasing each other through real sky. One of those pilots was Scott Altman, who would later become a NASA astronaut. That iconic inverted, Buzz the Tower moment? That wasn't Tom Cruise's hand flipping the bird. It was Altman's. So when you watch Top Gun, remember this. The sweat was fake. The danger was not. The volleyball scene Hollywood tried to kill. Why does the volleyball scene still get talked about nearly 40 years later? Because it wasn't about plot. It was about image. Tony Scott came from advertising. He understood visual language instinctively. How bodies, light, and movement communicate emotion without dialogue. The volleyball scene was shot during golden hour, with actors constantly coated in water and oil so their skin would reflect sunlight just right. Paramount executives hated it. They wanted more jets, less skin, less ambiguity. Scott refused. What the studio didn't understand was that this scene stripped away everything else. No uniforms, no ranks, no chain of command, just rivalry. For a moment, Maverick and Iceman weren't pilots, they were equals. Competitors. Two ideologies colliding in motion. It wasn't filler. It was subtext. And audiences felt it, even if they couldn't articulate why. Sometimes instinct beats logic. How many iconic moments exist only because someone refused to compromise? The sunglasses that refused to die. By the early 1980s, Ray-Ban aviators were fading fast. Sales had collapsed to around 18,000 pairs a year. They were associated with older men and outdated style. Then Tom Cruise put them on. Not as a fashion statement, but as identity. Maverick's aviators weren't accessories. They were armor. They projected speed, defiance, confidence, and detachment. Within months of Top Gun's release, aviator sales jumped 40%. Shopping malls turned into casting calls for cool. And decades later, when Top Gun, Maverick released in 2022, sales spiked again. Very few films resurrect a brand. Fewer still do it twice. So ask yourself, when was the last time a movie changed how people dressed? Val Kilmer, the rival who didn't want to exist. Val Kilmer didn't want to be Iceman. He thought Top Gun was shallow. He believed it glorified war. He actively tried to sabotage his audition. It didn't work. Contractually trapped, Kilmer leaned into resentment and transformed it into performance. He kept tension alive between himself and Tom Cruise off-screen. He limited interaction. He withheld warmth. The rivalry became real. That's why it works. Kilmer even built a backstory no one asked for. An emotionally neglected overachiever obsessed with control. The jaw-clenching, teeth snap wasn't scripted. It was Kilmer's idea. Years later, When a sequel was rumored and no one called him, Kilmer pitched himself. The actor who never wanted the role became one of cinema's most unforgettable rivals. Isn't that how great art often happens? Through resistance rather than enthusiasm? Bars, pianos, and the human core. Jets sell spectacle. Bars sell connection. Maverick singing, "You've lost that lovin' feelin'," isn't cool. It's awkward, risky, almost embarrassing. And yet, it works. Later, Great Balls of Fire gives us something rare, joy before loss. For a moment, Maverick and Goose aren't pilots. They're just friends. Those scenes humanized the film. They gave the audience something to lose. And when Goose dies, it hurts. Would Top Gun still matter without those moments? Or would it just be noise? The enemy that never existed. And then there are the MiGs. They weren't Russian. Hollywood couldn't borrow Soviet jets, so the filmmakers used Northrop F-5s, American training aircraft, painted black with red stars. They called them MiG-28s. A jet designation that doesn't exist. And that choice was deliberate. By inventing an enemy, the film avoided politics. No flags. No leaders. No ideology. Just the enemy. That's why Top Gun never aged into a political artifact. It became universal. Skill versus skill. Nerve versus nerve. A gladiator story at Mach speed. Ironically, the fake enemy jets mirrored reality. At the real Top Gun school, pilots trained against American F-5s painted as enemy aircraft. The illusion was closer to truth than anyone realized. The shot that broke physics and made history. And finally, there's the shot. Maverick inverts his jet, hovers impossibly close, flips the bird, and Goose snaps the photo. It's iconic. It's unforgettable. And it's completely impossible. The physics don't work. The airspeed differential would tear the aircraft apart. No pilot would attempt it. But none of that matters. Because cinema isn't about physics. It's about feeling. That moment captured Maverick's entire identity in a single frame. Defiance, recklessness, and a need to be seen. And maybe that's why Top Gun endures. Not because it told the truth, but because it told a truth people recognized. Final question. Top Gun wasn't perfect. It wasn't realistic. And it almost never happened. But somehow, against all odds, it became immortal. So let me ask you one last time. When you think back to the first time you saw it, what do you remember most? The jets? Or how it made you feel? Because maybe the most powerful movies aren't the ones that show us reality, but the ones that meet us exactly where we were when we needed them most. They called it impossible, and that's exactly why a single frame of Top Gun lodged in the public imagination like a splinter of light. Think back, an F-14 inverted above the sky, canopy rim gleaming, pilot's face visible in a handful of frames as if auditioning for a myth. Two airplanes, apparently inches apart, exchanging a glance that promised violence, ballet, and bravado all at once. It's complete nonsense. Or at least, it's ridiculous engineering. Any real naval aviator will tell you the geometry alone makes canopy-to-canopy proximity between two F-14s absurd. The Tomcat's twin vertical stabilizers and colossal tail assembly don't leave room for symmetric approaches like that. Its tail architecture is simply too wide and too tall. Bring two such beasts close, and you're flirting with the physics of a collision. Even the bravest pilot knows you keep a staggered formation for a reason, to preserve clearance and mitigate wake turbulence. Aerodynamics will punish you otherwise. And the aerodynamics, when you lower them into the equation, are merciless. Two jets separated by a distance small enough for human faces to be read would be subject to mutual interference in the air. The upwash and downwash, the vortices generated by high lift devices, slight yaw inputs or gusts, any of these can shove a perfectly piloted jet into a neighbor. The simplest, most honest way to put it, the airflow would conspire to pull them together. Fuel introduces another unforgiving constraint. Fighter jets are not built to sip from gravity's teat when inverted. The fuel system plumbing, pumps, scavenge lines, and pressurization runs on assumptions about orientation. For any production jet, Inverted flight beyond perhaps a few dozen seconds invites starvation and flameout. Gravity will rearrange the contents of fuel tanks and hand an engine a handful of vapor when it expected a meal. So how did they film it? They didn't. Not in the way our eyes wanted to believe. Dave Baranek, a real Top Gun instructor and a veteran aviator who flew camera sequences for the movie, has explained how those moments were staged. The MiG pilots, actors staring in alarm, were actually piloting their aircraft next to a camera-equipped Learjet. At the appropriate beat, they craned their necks skyward and acted startled. There was nothing above them. The inverted F-14, the one stealing the sky and the scene, was layered in afterward through optical compositing. It was one of the few pure visual effects in a movie otherwise obsessed with real machines and real motion. Does that discovery ruin the image? Or does it make it more fascinating? Tony Scott, director, stylist, and the man with the cigarette-smoked aesthetic, understood something crucial. Movies are not engineering textbooks. They are emotional engines. What matters is not whether metal could actually kiss metal, but whether the picture reads as danger, swagger, and myth. The inverted Tomcat served those ends beautifully. In optical isolation, it is a lie. In cinematic truth, it is a promise. Watch this movie and you will feel the sky differently. Maverick's motorcycle deserves a chapter of its own. The bike functions in the film like a punctuation mark, an acceleration of identity where the pilot's world and the teenage dream of speed collide. In 1984, Kawasaki released the GPZ 900R, marketed and mythologized later as the first Ninja. Liquid-cooled, 16-valve, electronically advanced for its time, it crushed the idea of what a production bike could be. Its top speed, advertised and tested, was around 151 miles per hour. For a cinematic era that idolized velocity, the bike was perfect. Something raw enough to race a jet down the tarmac and credible enough to make the idea not entirely frivolous. Here's the part that underlines the movie's commitment to dread and honesty. Tom Cruise had never ridden a motorcycle before filming. None. Zero. He learned in a small dealership parking lot in El Cajon, California, taught by anxious and patient clerks rather than a closed course or a professional stunt trainer. And yet, in the film, he rides helmetless at speed, an image that flattened any concerns for continuity into pure cinematic myth. The bike's badges were removed because Kawasaki refused the typical unpaid product placement. They only furnished bikes to the production on dealer cost terms after being burned before. That bureaucratic tiff didn't stop the bike from becoming part of cultural shorthand. The Ninja label soon came to mean raw, dangerous momentum. The motorcycle scene is more than showmanship. It's a careful beat in a character study. Maverick does not merely ride. He asserts. Where the F-14 is sanctioned aggression, government property and public spectacle, the bike is individual risk, private defiance. One is honor in formation. The other is a solo stunt. That contrast is the film's heartbeat. Modern sequels often fail to recapture the lightning of what came before. They attempt replication and produce pale imitations. So it's worth pausing over a different kind of cinematic miracle. Top Gun. Maverick. The 36-year gap between films was not simply an impatience of studios but a generational chasm. The sequel arrived in 2022 and did the near impossible. It revisited the old icons while refreshing the tone and texture for a world that had learned to be wary of glib heroism. The film was not nostalgia alone. It managed to be elegiac and muscular at once. It earned broad critical acclaim and a staggering box office, the kind of commercial success that today reads as a cultural event. It also snagged award season attention that original blockbusters rarely receive. The sequel was proof that spectacle, done with care, can still move hearts and minds without surrendering to irony. Yet even those later accolades highlight a contradiction. Spectacle asks for recognition but often refuses to humble itself. At Cannes, Tom Cruise was showered with adulation. At some ceremonies, the industry's formal nods were quieter. Did Cruise miss some formal recognition by not being present? Perhaps. Does that absence read as dedication or as a matter of scheduling? Perspective shapes meaning as deftly as editing. Then there's the love scene, Take My Breath Away. A moment that almost didn't make its way into the movie. That sequence illustrates something about creative filmmaking that's easy to miss. Limitation often creates invention. The romance between Maverick and Charlie wasn't plotted as a central axis of the picture. It evolved through test screenings, which in some places, Chicago among them, asked for more intimacy. The scene was shot months after principal photography wrapped. Crews borrowed for a day while shooting elsewhere. Kelly McGillis, who had changed her hair, hid it under a cap. Lighting and silhouette masked continuity sins. The result was a scene that reads neither as fake nor contrived. It feels like a memory reconstructed in blue, timeless, hazy, and decisive. Choice and constraint, again, turned a potential disaster into one of the decade's most enduring sequences. How often does a last-minute improvisation become the emotional center of a cultural artifact? Sound is another axis where Top Gun became larger than itself. The soundtrack wasn't mere background. It functioned as cultural acceleration. Imagine theaters exiting to Kenny Loggins' Danger Zone, or the aching swirl of Berlin's Take My Breath Away. These were not incidental tracks. They were anthems. They crashed into pop radio and music television and left fingerprints across a younger generation's playlist. That Danger Zone was rejected, passed over, nearly orphaned. These are the dark comedy of hits. Imagine a different selection process in which the movie's musical identity had been assigned differently. Would the film have felt other than it did? Most likely. Music didn't simply score scenes. It wrote the film's atmospheric shorthand. But all this gloss, motorcycles, music, impossible frames, casts a shadowed counterpoint, the cost of real flight. Not every awe-inspiring shot was an illusion or a careful edit. Art Scholl, a legendary aerial cinematographer who had worked on The Right Stuff and other high-end sequences, died during a stunt for the film. On September 16, 1985, he attempted a flat spin over the Pacific. Transmission in the cockpit, as the story has been told, moved from normal to alarm to silence within the space of seconds. I've got a problem. Then, I've really got a problem. Then nothing. His plane hit the ocean. No definitive cause was publicly confirmed. The production included a dedication to his memory. That small printed line at the end of the film is quiet and severe. A reminder that some of the danger on screen was not safe or simulated but real, and it exacted a price. The risk threaded through the production was not merely stunt-driven bravado. Flying at low altitudes, choreographing multiple aircraft in dynamic maneuvers, and fitting actors into this environment required rigorous discipline. The Navy's cooperation, officials permitting access to aircraft, pilots, and runways, wasn't a stamp of endorsement for Hollywood's fantasies. It was a careful, negotiated partnership. Yet part of the movie's power came from the blurring of that partnership. The film looked as if it could be real because it had so much real in it. Which raises a question. Do movies that use real elements, real airplanes, real pilots, real places, bear a greater ethical responsibility for accuracy? Or does cinematic truth live by different laws? Top Gun certainly did rebrand the Navy in the public imagination. Fewer than a decade after Vietnam, the film recast the service member as slick, charismatic, and heroic. The recruits who marched through recruitment centers after the movie were not all idealistic or naive. Many saw the Navy as a place of extraordinary challenge and technical mastery. Recruiters reported an uptick in interest. It wasn't a literal five-fold spike in enlistment, but it was noticeable and meaningful. Hollywood had offered a reimagined mirror and many young people stepped toward it. That mirror was selective. The film edited away the day-to-day bureaucracy, the moral complexities, and the long-term wear of military life. Instead it presented a condensed worldview where courage, skill, and a certain roguish individualism are rewarded on a soundtrack of adrenaline. The question then becomes, what responsibility does popular media have when it reshapes institutional images for an entire generation? Beyond institutional consequences, Top Gun's long-term cultural effects are naughty. It revitalized the action hero as a worshipful figure, one where personal risk and personal charisma compensated for narrative nuance. It also contributed a particular aesthetic. Leather jackets, aviators, and a certain 70s and 80s gloss that cycles through fashion and then back into nostalgia. In markets across the world, the movie functioned as a cultural export of American bravado, retrieved and reinterpreted locally. When a film becomes shorthand, when a single frame or line stands for an era, it has begun to create its own afterlife. Which brings us back to the image of two jets and the transgressive impossibility of their proximity. The truth of movie making is often a bargain. You will be lied to about how something happens if, in exchange, you are made to feel it more deeply. Top Gun sold that bargain with precision. The inverted F-14 is a fake, optical trickery lying on top of real flying, and yet the feeling it delivers is authentic. It registers as audacity because it was deliberately assembled to read that way. Do we value the cinematic lie less if we know the mechanics behind it? Or does knowing the artifice make the artwork more impressive, revealing the cleverness required to manufacture sensation? There is also a personal arc embedded in the film center that often gets folded into the mythology. Maverick himself. He is less a fully developed psychodrama and more an archetype. Reckless talent, haunted by loss, flirting with discipline. The film leaves space for the audience to project their own anxieties and bravado onto him. Why does he push? Why does he flirt with failure? What do we see in him when we praise him? Are we celebrating technical genius or romanticized irresponsibility? Those questions are not small. They keep returning whenever a cultural figure repurposes risk as identity. The sequel, in many ways, revisited those questions with some humility. It aged its protagonist, acknowledged cost and consequence, and tried to temper swagger with reflection. Where the original served as a recruitment ad and a pop-cultural shot of adrenaline, the sequel became a conversation about legacy and transition. It asked, what does maturity look like when measured against the same sky? Even a film that traffics in myth must answer to the lived details if it wants to hold up over decades. The original Top Gun did that in part through small, precise choices. The motorcycle scene that introduces Maverick, the music that colors the film's emotional palette, the sacrifice implicit in the aerial filmmaking. The storytellers and technicians knew where they could cheat and where they could not. That blend of artifice and authenticity made the movie more than a collection of moments. It made it a cultural engine. What is the film's ultimate legacy? Not accuracy. Not even pure celebration. It's something more cunning. The ability to make a generation feel an image as authority. Movies, at their best, teach us how to see. Top Gun taught many people how to see airplanes as instruments of personal myth, jets as extensions of personality and danger. That framing had real effects, on recruitment, on fashion, on music, and it left a mark. Top Gun was not accurate. It wasn't always realistic. It did, however, understand that cinema's primary obligation is to the heartbeat of an audience, the visceral sensation of being alive under a wide blue sky. And sometimes, in the economy of myth, that is enough.